Recording in progress. Hello, my name is Mary Beth Hines. I'm excited to be the host of Keys for SLPs Learning from Legends series in honor of ASHA's 100th anniversary. Today, I'm joined by a co-host for this episode, Elizabeth Ardoin MS CCC SLP, who is a presenter and moderator for Speech Therapy PD. She is the coordinator of assistive technology for St. Tammany Parish Public Schools in Louisiana. Before we begin, a reminder that this episode is available for Point One ASHA CEU. If you are joining us on a podcast platform and would like to earn ASHA CEUs, please complete all course modules for this episode on your Speech Therapy PD account. If you have questions during this live podcast, please put them in the chat box and we will answer questions at the end of the podcast. And here are our disclosures. Mary Beth Hines, the host of Keys for SLP's podcast, receives compensation from Speech Therapy PD. She is also employed by Life Speech Pathology and the nonprofit Voices for Parkinson's. Elizabeth Ardoin receives financial compensation from Speech Therapy PD for co-hosting this episode. Dr. Carole Zangari receives book royalties from Paul H. Brooks Publishing Company and Attainment. She is owner, author of Practical AAC website. She is an AAC Strand Advisor for ATIA and a PI for Stepping into AAC grant.
Okay, and now let's meet our guest, Dr. Carole Zangari. Dr. Carole Zangari PhD, CCC SLP, ASHA Fellow, is a professor in the Speech Language Pathology Department at Nova Southeastern University, where she teaches graduate courses in AAC and serves as the executive director of the NSU Center for Autism and Related Disabilities. Dr. Zangari is the co-editor of Practically Speaking Language, Literacy, and Academic Development for Students with AAC Needs and co-author of the Tell Me AAC in the Classroom, Tell Me MAS, and Tell Me 2 Elementary and Middle School Edition. Dr. Zangari also co-authored a multimedia online training module on AAC and autism for Ocali. She blogs at www.practicalaac.org. Welcome, Dr. Zangari. We're so excited to get to know a little bit more about you and learn about your career, research, contributions to the field, and perspectives on the future.
Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth, Mary Beth, Yumi. Thank you so much for the kind invitation to be with you today. I really do feel honored. And thanks to all that are joining today. You know, if you know me at all, you know, I could talk AAC till the cows come home. So just delighted to be invited. Thank you.
Well, we are so honored to have you and honored to have our co-host who specializes in AAC. I have had some experience with AAC as an SLP. So I'm really excited to learn more, but our true expert co-host is Elizabeth today. And our true legend today is Dr. Carole Zangari. So it is really such an honor for us to have you and join the other legends who have been part of this series. So we've tried to make this fun, and we've started out the same way for each podcast. So just for fun, can you tell us something about yourself that people may not know?
Okay, super fun to start this way. So something that people may not know about me is that I feel like I've been working my whole life. I got my first job when I was in third grade. I was paid 75 cents a week to walk a kindergartner through the streets of Philadelphia to school. And in fourth grade, I got 75 cents a week for that. In fourth grade, I had 2 students. So I made a whopping $1.50 a week. And I kind of did that till, you know, we moved away from Philadelphia. And then my next job was at age 13. I worked for a doll maker, cutting out patterns like for the doll bodies and the clothes. And so I did that for like 2 years. And then at 15, I got hired as a nurse's aide. Now, you could never do that today. It was before the CNA certificate and all of that. But I did that, you know, from the time I was 15. And then when I went to college, you know, I did it, you know, was a nurse's aide in hospitals and things like that. And then when I was in college, I went to University of Pittsburgh. I had a wonderful opportunity to work in group homes. And so this was at a time in Pennsylvania where the deinstitutionalization movement was underway. And so I was one of those folks who, when they were closing those large residential public facilities, like with thousands of people, there were lots of adults with intellectual disabilities in their 40s and 50s and 60s, right, who had been institutionalized when they were like 6, 7 years old, lived their whole life in segregated facilities with, hundreds of other people. And they were just being moved into, group apartments in the city. So I got to do that. So when I say I've been working, feel like I've been working with my whole life, I kind of mean it.
You kind of have. You are a worker bee from a very young age. So interesting to be part of that deinstitutionalization movement and helping people. Of course, there wasn't probably a lot of electronic AAC at that time, but were you using any type of AAC with the people you were helping?
Well, yeah, although it didn't have that name yet. But yeah, and Mary Beth, that's a great question. Let me give you one quick example. So the apartment that I was assigned to had 3 men in their 50s who had lived their whole lives in this residential institution since they were little boys. And now they were in the community, and we were taking them, to go get their hair cut, to go to McDonald's, to go banking, to get their groceries, doing all of these things. And they had grown up in these institutions. And while I'm not a fan of segregated living, I can say there are a couple of advantages. And one was that you could train up everybody, right? Because, they lived, around, aides and nurses and janitor. You could train them all up, right? So everybody there knew keyword signing. So the folks that had significant communication difficulties often knew a lot of signs. So they came out of these institutions really being able to, communicate very effectively, but they did a lot of signing. Well, now you're at, Golden, Green Giant or Golden Eagle or McDonald's or the bank, and they're signing to people, and they are just very confused and frustrated when people didn't understand them, right? And because of their level of intellectual disability, they didn't really understand why that was happening or my explanation for it. So we developed a little, routine for them, like a little wallet card, right, that they could pull out of their wallet that had a couple communication messages in there. And we sort of taught them the routine that, like, if you meet somebody you don't know, the first thing you do is you say, hey, do you sign? And if they do anything other than yes, back to you, then you pull out your little wallet card that, had some basic information. So, it's pretty old school and pretty unsophisticated, but yeah, we were using some forms of, less conventional communication even back then.
Well, those wallet cards can be handy still today with everything else that we
Right.
have. So sometimes old school is the best school, right?
Right.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing that. And
Sure.
I think we can say that you were born for this work.
So I love the idea of the wallet card, the original low-tech AAC, right? So I know you shared a little bit about your journey. Can you tell us a little bit more about what led you to speech pathology in your early career and how you chose this area?
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, I got a head start on the helping professions. I was a candy striper and a sniff in the 70s. And in that, I really had some experiences that guided me to AAC specifically. And there were kind of 2 in particular that can't come to mind. One was that one of my little jobs was to deliver mail around the facility, right? And through that, I met Mr. Stefanik. And he got mail from overseas. And in those days, this really is dating me, right? There were airmail envelopes, with like the little border around it. And they were really like exotic things to a 14-year-old, those thin paper envelopes. They kind of, promise to peek into countries I've only, like read about in my school books or National Geographic magazine. And Mr. Stefanik was a resident who kept to himself. He rarely came out of his room. He was the only one that got these sort of treasures, and I was going to determine to share his bounty. He had had a stroke. He was like really densely hemiplegic. had great difficulty expressing himself. I didn't know it then, of course, but he had profound apraxia of speech. But he was a really persistent communicator, and through like one-arm gestures and pantomime and just using objects in the environment, he usually found a way, to kind of get his point across. And so, I think, I had so many questions for him, like, why was he getting letters from so far away, with beautiful stamps that I didn't recognize, and who was writing to him and why, and what did they say? And so most of the time, we just had to communicate with very limited speech, but through those gestures and through, pantomime, using things in the environment. I learned that, I mean, it was just fascinating in bits and pieces over the months, learned that he had been a performer in his younger days and had traveled throughout Europe as a high wire walker. So scaling buildings and walking atop bridges and performing in circuses, traversing ravines, in Hungary and Serbia, Romania. And so, over time, you just learn all these cool things, right? And just, it really kind of set the stage for my interest in less conventional forms of communication. And I think the other resident that really impacted me and kind of drew me to AAC was Matthew. He was a 7-year-old boy who had a severe head injury. He had fallen out of a tree and, severe head injury. He was admitting to the nursing home where I was volunteering. In those days, they didn't have as many options, and because I was the youngest person around, the nursing staff, my mom was a charge nurse, they kind of made me a very informal part of his care team. Right. So, as, a 14, 15-year-old, I learned how to do passive range of motion and cognitive stimulation. And I learned all about Berta and Carl Bobath, before I was old enough to drive. And so like in the weeks and months of his coma recovery, as Matthew's alertness levels improved, as his skills improved, my role kind of translated, kind of morphed a bit into being like a translator and more of a friend. But communicating in alternative ways was really part of our journey together. So when I got the chance, I got a little older and I had to make some career decisions. I was kind of wavering between PT and SLP and was able to shadow both kinds of professionals. And man, PT just, was great, but SLP really grabbed me, right? That love of language, the range of different things you could do. It really just kind of pulled me in.
I have 2 nieces that are both undergraduates in speech pathology right now. And that's exactly what I've been telling them. Like, you're going to love this field. There's such a range of things that we can specialize in and learn about.
Yeah, it's so true.
So true. Well, we're so happy that it did pull you in, and the contributions that you have made to the field. So thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Mr. Stefanik. All right, well, let's dive into the area of AAC. How has the treatment and evaluation of AAC disorders evolved through the years, and especially throughout your career? And kind of a follow-up to that, when did you make the decision that AAC was going to be an area of specialty for you?
Maybe I'll start with that second part first. So when I was, when I graduated with my master's degree, once I graduated, I remained interested in AAC because I had had some externship experiences in a different residential institution where I had actually worked nights, as an aide, right, changing, diapers and all that stuff. But I did, an externship there when I was a graduate student, and there were opportunities for AAC learning there. So, I was doing a lot of different things, but it really sort of, continued to kind of fuel my interest. And once I was graduated, I felt like I was already kind of of pulled in that direction. I took a job with Temple University in Philadelphia, serving adults with very severe challenging behavior and intellectual disability. So it was a fascinating experience, a little bit intimidating because you first had to get a lot of training on, managing clients who were very aggressive, who had a lot of self-injurious behavior, but it was a terrific experience. And in that, I had a very old school clinical supervisor for my CF, and she was a real stickler for developing clinical skills. She did not allow her clinicians to rely on fun games or fancy materials. She wanted us to be trained, highly trained in our intervention strategies. So she kind of used that bird on a branch analogy, right? A bird trusts its wings, not the branch it lands on, right? So she used to really do things to challenge us, the clinicians who worked with her. So she would do things like, like if I was running a group with individuals with significant challenging behaviors and intellectual disabilities, she'd meet me at the door, right? She'd kind of hold out her hands, right? And I'd have to hand over all my materials for the therapy session.
Wow.
And run the group, right? And she'd be observing it, and it was tough. And I never did that to my own students, but I sure did learn a lot, right? And I think another life lesson that she really instilled on me, that I'm very grateful for, was that she told me that first year as a CF, that she'd contribute $500 to a trip to San Francisco for my first ASHA convention. Now, $500 is a lot of money, but back in the early 80s, it went a lot further. But I scrimped and saved to cover the rest of my flight and hotel and registration. And really, from that point, have really made it a practice to get to convention as often as I could, like soaking up everything you can, and convention. And so at that first convention, Dr. Marianne Romsky and Rose Sevchek, pioneers in AAC, they were doing a poster session on adults with developmental disabilities, and nobody was talking about that clinical population at the time. So I totally cornered them and picked their brains for the entire time. And it was very beneficial, not just for that, but they also encouraged me to go back and get a PhD, and they connected me with Dr. Lyle Lloyd, one of the early pioneers in AAC, who then recruited me for, that doctoral leadership grant and gave me a chance to do a fellowship in AAC at Purdue University. So that was an intense experience, but I just loved it. I had so many incredible, opportunities, like running an AAC technical assistance team, for the state of Indiana. And let's see, I was the first editorial assistant for the AAC Journal, right? These were in pre-internet days, no email, right? So as a doctoral student, I was having frequent conversations with associate editors like David Buchelman or Joe Richley or Pat Miranda or, Jan Bendrosian, right? Really, it just really fueled that passion, interfacing with them and manufacturers for, different AAC companies and all those sorts of things. So, those are the things that I think really, kind of kept me, tied to AAC in those early years. And pretty much everything has changed about it since I've started, right? Like you do something long enough and that's what happens. But, AAC technology was just developing at that time. So when we got to, visit, the Prenke company, their factory, or host visits from the founders of Dynavox, the devices at that time, the voices were super robotic, right? And they were pretty much blank slates, they were more or less empty boxes, when it came to the vocabulary and the symbols and the words and messages. As clinicians, we had to program a lot of stuff in from scratch, figure out what words to add and where to, locate them, until some of those, the commercially available programs, like some of those MinSpeak application programs came along, there was a lot more of that the SLPs, had to do. So pretty much everything has changed.
When was that? When did it change to that things were a little bit more pre-programmed?
I would say probably in the early 90s, you start to see a lot more of that. And that gave us so much more flexibility as clinicians as the technology evolved. It, in some ways, it made our jobs a lot easier. And like, I try not to do this with my grad student and say, when I was your age, I walked 2 miles in 2 feet of snow to get to the bus.
That's okay. This is a forum where you can do that. This is kind of what it's about. We're learning from our legends.
But really, I mean, those were, it really was, a very different sort of, learning platform. So like if you're doing an AAC evaluation, in those days, you had to know before you knew anything else what the access method was going to be. Right? Because if they needed alternative access and scanning, that was one device, right? If you needed direct selection, that was a different device, right? So, now, of course, the technology has so much built-in flexibility that if someone loses the ability, God forbid, to be a direct selector and they now need scanning or eye gaze, it doesn't necessarily mean that I got to ditch the technology we've been using, right? I may be able to like reconfigure it in certain ways or do a little add-on to it to allow for eye gaze or, set it up, use a different page setup to make scanning more efficient. So in some ways, the change in technology, while it's a lot harder to keep up with, right? So there's a shadow and a light side to everything. It did give us a lot more flexibility in some ways.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I'm thinking about all the programming that I've done on devices, as you're saying that, Dr. Zangari, like even in the early 2000s, when I was a young CF, we were still doing lots and lots of programming, and you didn't have access, like you said, to all these great symbols and decent voices as well.
Right. Well, another thing that I'm thinking about is in terms of like your original question, Elizabeth, about like the evolution of the field. One of the most significant evolutions, outside of like the technology sort of realm has been that there's a much greater range of professionals really involved in helping people with complex communication needs kind of navigate their AAC journey. When I first started, it was really almost everything was, the SLP, did it or it didn't get done. And now it's much more of a team perspective.
I agree. And I appreciate that big team
Oh,
perspective. I don't
I've
know
learned, yeah.
from the PTs and OTs, VI, it's
Yep.
so many things to
Teachers,
learn.
absolutely. I'm thinking of a group that I ran with a teacher, like a cooking group in that CF year, not only did I learn how to cook with chopsticks and a couple Filipino recipes, right? There were so many things that she knew to do instinctively, or not instinctively, but through her training and experiences that really accelerated my learning in terms of how to do good instruction and intervention.
Okay, well, can you share a few pivotal research topics that have significantly impacted you for the field of AAC?
Oh boy, that's a fun one. So here's a perspective. Individual research studies can be fascinating, but by design, they each answer a very small, narrow, limited question, right? That's how research has to be, right? And so I am deeply grateful to those researchers who pursue a really carefully constructed line of research, right? That looks at an area and picks away at it one study at a time. It sounds like I'm trivializing it, and I don't mean to do that, but have multiple studies in the same line that really help us gradually better understand a particular topic. So each study reveals different aspects of the issue that needs to be explored so that we have a better understanding of how to do this work. And I find that not all researchers do that, right? Some of them love methodologies, right? Like, so I'm really into, let's say, meta-analyses. So I'm going to do all these meta-analyses, but they're in all different areas. Well, that's great. And that has a a real important role in our field. But what I tend to really appreciate is sort of stuff getting rolled out over time. So, okay, this study revealed, something I should do differently in my intervention. I start to use that, I get the hang of it, and then I open my AAC journal, and what do you know? There's another strategy or a nuance about that strategy or something I need to know that I can then work on next. So that's kind of like the sort of like atmosphere that I'm approaching this question in. And I would say with that in mind, Dr. Gloria Soto's research on AAC language intervention has significantly shaped the best practices for supporting our students, particularly those with motor speech disorders. So, the work, if you're familiar with it, has really emphasized the importance of discourse-based, very meaningful language instruction. And what I love about her AAC language intervention research is that it offers those of us who see ourselves as kind of clinicians first, right? It offers us like actionable guidance. So as clinicians, we can kind of sink our teeth in it and say, okay, let's think about, how are we going to incorporate this in our work with Billy, right? So, how are we going to prioritize discourse-based invention, move beyond that isolated vocabulary or grammar work, right? Embed language instruction within meaningful conversations, within narratives, within academic context, right? So we're supporting that syntax and morphology, right? How can we target grammar skills that reflect, real life communication needs, including different sentence constituents or pronouns, verb form, all of that. So I really, really appreciate, those researchers who evolve a line of research in an area and have those things that are actionable for clinicians and others, on the team.
Thank you. Well, what further research would you like to see developed to advance AAC?
Let me think now. Further research. Well, we're a relatively new field. And so, we have lots of opportunities, but from the kinds of things that I love doing language therapy. We need much more information to guide us in terms of how to design and implement language intervention, right? We're definitely starting through Dr. Soto, and that's SOTO, Gloria Soto. She's at Penn State University. We're starting to understand more about strategies that give us positive outcomes, but an awful lot is needed. So I would love to see more researchers picking up that mantle. So what should the sequence of instructional activities look like, right? What about dosing? We know almost nothing about how how much of a particular kind of intervention is necessary to help an AAC user, sort of achieve their potential, right? And think about it, right? The technology is going to get better and better, right? No doubt about that. But anybody who's done this work, that having access to the right technology is not going to solve all your communication problems, right? And so Dave Buchelman, who was the editor of, the AAC Journal for many years and a pioneer in so many ways, has a very famous quote, right? Having a communication device doesn't make you a communicator any more than having a piano makes you a musician, right? These are great tools, right? But for most people, it's going to take years of instruction, a heck of a lot of practice before we get good at. So I would love to see a lot more language intervention research, preferably, right, with good ecological validity. That would be high on my priorities. I think beyond that, because, I'm a clinical educator and my day job is, teach that next generation of clinicians, I'm always thinking about implementation science, right? What are the best ways to scale, scale up those best practices in AAC so that the people who need the support get it, right? I think, there's been some, great stuff that's informing some of that. We've got some, relatively recent studies that help us know that, particular strategies that improve, AAC adoption and reduce abandonment, things like, coaching and mentoring, right? We know that that ongoing support for teachers and SLPs, it increases fidelity, right? It builds their confidence. Yeah, but how do we make that happen? Right? We know the collaborative teaming, right? Active collaboration among educators, therapists, that's going to improve implementation. But how do we make that happen, right? So some of them are suggesting, the use of implementation frameworks, the consolidated framework for implementation research, is one of them. But I think that would be high, that would probably be next, kind of on my list in terms of, priorities for research. And one more, if you'll indulge me.
Well, please, please.
Please, yeah.
Assessment, right? We need well-designed research that helps us identify what's the best AAC tool for a particular person and how can we do that in sustainable ways, right? So we have a little bit of research on AAC assessment practices and what clinicians do in evaluating to select devices, but it's not tied to outcomes. And that's what I'd love to see, right? I'd love to see research that moves us forward in assessment. Wouldn't it be great to have studies that say, hey, we looked at assessment with this specific clinical population and we did it in this particular way and found that if you follow this protocol and you implement it with fidelity, you're going to end up with AAC tools that are really likely to be utilized for a long time, right? Wouldn't it be great to have research-driven protocols for people with AAC needs who are different ages, different ability levels, different etiologies, right? And just have that protocol that helps us, have confidence that, if we would do things in this way, it would really lead to positive learning gains in our AAC users. So those would be kind of my top 3 for research priorities.
And that goes to children and adults because, there are some populations that have progressive,
Yep.
diagnoses. And they can't get the AAC until they progress to a certain point, but they really need it before they progress to that point so they can learn how to use it before they need it.
And it's just crazy beans, right? Like when you think about it, like, you don't want to wait till somebody is unable to speak, right? If they have, ALS or another degenerative disease, before they get these supports and services, they'll have no energy. We lose the opportunity to do voice banking and do, preserve legacy messages and all of that. But the way the funding systems kind of work in the US, or it doesn't make any sense. If you lived at a skilled nursing facility, try to get a speech generating device, right? Because it doesn't meet DME, right, in the same way, right? So I unfortunately I've had to do evaluations or been party to them where somebody had to get discharged for a period of time to get evaluated and get AAC devices, and then once they were set, get readmitted. Like,
Wow.
what's up with that? Like,
That is wrong on so many levels.
right?
Yeah.
That's
Like
mind
you
blowing.
don't have to be like, you just have to be human to know that's not such a good thing to do to people.
No. So let's get that research.
Yes, I love the idea for more assessment research, and then the big steps is all the implementation.
Yeah.
Because that's where the meat of everything is, all
Yeah.
about implementation.
Yeah, and you know what? It's hard everywhere, right?
Yes.
It's hard everywhere. It's not just in the field of speech language pathology. I mean, it's, physician, for example, physician education, when there are changes and things, to get them to implement it and practice. That knowledge translation piece is problematic for probably most helping professions.
Okay, well, can you tell us about what is the most significant change you have seen during your career?
Well, we touched a little bit about technology,
Mhm.
right? And so, I think that's pretty much the obvious one. We had a lot of huge gains in the early 90s. More recently, of course, the mobile technology kind of revolution and the iPad and the app and all of that. There are things I love, everything has a shadow and a light size. There are things I love about it, the things that make me go, but there's no denying that it has raised the awareness of AAC in the general population. It has made things more affordable and accessible to people. So, I'm not going to be a purist and say it's not perfect, don't do it. No. That's not the kind of world, that we can live in. We have to, move forward incrementally, deal with what we have, and just, make a commitment to keep on, keep on going. So I think technology, is a big one. One of the things I'm most excited about now in how technology is evolving is having voices that reflect different kinds of bodies, different genders, different ethnicities, a greater range of languages. Like you've got some people probably on the call today, they're maybe in a school that serves, I don't know, maybe 76 different languages in their school, right? Like, okay, well, we've got AAC systems for what, maybe 30 of those. And, there's probably 8 of them that are accessible to the average SLP, right? So we've got a long way to go, but we are moving in that direction. And that's, really, really exciting. I think beyond that, I think another really significant change is sort of like, how do I want to put this? Almost like flattening the power structure. So we've moved away to, from more of an expert model to one where there is collaborative decision making and more efforts to center AAC users in that process. We have a long way to go, but we're doing a much better job of listening to and learning from AAC users. And that is a big change from when I first started, where like we had a protocol, you had to do it, or, come hell or high water, right? You just had to do that, right? And now, we have a ways to go, but it's made a tremendous impact on what we do and how we do it. And I'll just give one current example, right? If you're not one who does AAC assessments, you may not know that the gold standard for doing that is the feature match process, where we do some assessment work. We try to come up with, what are the characteristics or the features of an AAC device that seem important for this particular individual based on my assessment data. And then we try to develop like a short list, right, of devices that have those characteristics. And then we do a trial period of them with a couple different devices to see, okay, well, that sounded good. Let's see how it really works in your real life. And so, that's great in theory, right? But it's terribly disruptive to an AAC user's life, right? So imagine being the parent of a kid who's trialing a device for the past month. Maybe they haven't, had such great communication experiences, but they've been trialing it for a month. He's starting to get the hang of it. It's going well. 6 weeks into this, right, we get our data and we say, hey, that's been great. We're going to just take that away and move on to this other device. Got different symbols. It's different technology. It sounds different. Everything's in a different place. Like, I can't even imagine how frustrating it is to be on the receiving end of that. The parent, but what about that kid? Like, are you kidding me? Like, you just spent 6 weeks challenging me to learn that new stuff. Now it just disappears from my life, right? And you put me back to square one. I don't think so. So I think these days we're more likely to get that client or family input on the process and do some pivoting, right? When the things that we had planned is not working for them. So it seems like a little thing, but hey, I'd love to have healthcare professionals who ask for my input on the plan of care for me, right? It's just not how things work. But I do see us moving in a very positive direction with regard to that.
Yeah, I love getting the AAC user involved. I know several conferences I've attended. We have AAC users actually presenting and telling us their experiences, and that's invaluable.
I was just teaching my graduate students about the importance of teaching their clients how to do sort of qualitative ratings, like a Likert scale, right? So we were talking about a client, with intellectual disabilities and autism and apraxia, and why we chose to, in the activity, have him rate it, right? So every week we were doing a different science experiment, and he had to give it a 1, 2, or 3 stars. Well, why that is important is because it's such a flexible communication strategy. Like, so if you are wanting to be involved in the decision making for your AAC device, if you have the skills to essentially convey, I liked it, but not as much as that last one that you had, that's huge, right? That's skill building in the area of self-advocacy. And we're doing it in ways that sort of honor, all of the things we need to do as speech language pathologists with our, ICD-10 codes and, CPT codes and all of that. But what we're really working on are the skills that underlie the philosophy that most of us have these days in building their ability to be strong advocates for themselves. It takes skills to do that.
Yeah, and I see that a lot doing AAC assessments. And sometimes the students, they just gravitate towards one system, and it makes you blink and look twice because you're like, did that really just happen? And they just have a preference. And so that's what we're going to move forward and trial first and honor their preferences.
Yeah, I mean, all things being equal, I always say the best device for an individual is the one that's going to be well implemented. And if you like it and the teacher likes it, right, then, there may be 2 others that are equally appropriate for the individual. But if everybody has some level of buy-in into this one, we'd be silly to ignore that.
So again, I have not really worked in AAC in the schools since my internship in grad school. So do some school districts require you to trial a certain number or more than one, or is that up to the SLP?
Well, certainly the funders do, right? So like if you're going for public funding, let's say through Medicaid or even private insurance funding, they want to know, among other things, many other things, right? That's why your report is 2 inches thick. But they want to know, what else did you try before you came up with this recommendation? And why is this a better option than those others that might be even cheaper or already, available in some other ways? So you have to have some data-based rationale and justification for that device selection. So that's one aspect of it. But I think, I would say that most schools and in your participants here today and in other, experiences can correct me if I'm wrong in this, but, I do get called in a fair amount to this school or that school. I don't see the gold standard being used very much in schools, right? And that tells me that we need that assessment research, right? Because what we are teaching people in grad school is the gold standard. What we're writing about in our textbooks as the gold standard is not feasible for clinicians to do in all environments. Otherwise, they'd be doing it. Right. And so we've got to figure something out to have, a better meeting of the minds so that, we get these good matches made. But that long circuitous answer, Mary Beth, is yes, some schools will require that multiple trial. It is a best practice. And, it I think also gives us as clinicians, I think for me, it always gives me a little bit more confidence in the end result. If the client has actually put their hands on it and used it for a while, right? Because it can be a bit of a slog getting from having your device to getting to where you're using it all day, every day, right? And that takes a lot of effort for some of our learners. And so if they're involved in the selection process, don't you think they're going to be more invested in the tool that they ultimately get because they were part of the team that said, yeah, this is the one.
But to your point earlier, to have to trial multiple devices when the student or the user has decided that they like one better, but you're trialing multiple devices in some cases to appease the funders or to serve the funders versus to serve the student.
That's right. I would say that if nothing else, SLPs are a creative bunch.
Yeah, yes.
We have lots of ways to do this. And if not, we hang out with OTs. And boy, if anybody's more creative than us, it's our OT friends. I think that, we may modify how we do it. Say, okay, you know what? How about for this next trial, you'll keep using what you have, but for this next trial, we're going to do that just in our therapy sessions. Right. For the next 8 sessions, we're going to do some things to give you some trial experiences with this other thing, but I'm not going to pull it from your the one that you have been trialing from your day-to-day use. So sometimes we can negotiate an agreement like that because you do need data, right, for each of these trials. And generally you want that apples to apples comparison, right? I think, we try to do more than just lip service to it, but also honor the reality that AAC users and their families are experiencing when we ask them to do these trials.
I think it's very important while we're talking about doing the different trials, you mentioned, Dr. Zangari, the families, that they understand this process as well. It's not like an x-ray where it's one and done. It's an ongoing time process to figure out what works best for their AAC user.
Elizabeth, I'm so glad that you raised that because I think, the most frequent issue that gets raised to me, either, many of our students are already working as SLPAs in schools or, their teacher, whatever. So either from students who are already working in the field or through, conferences or, practical AAC, one of the biggest things that I hear from folks is that, oh, my student has an AAC device, but they don't really use it. Right. So I hear that very often. And I think one of the things that we can do to help in those situations is to better prepare the client and the family for what is normal or typical in this process. So before I get before we've gone too far down this road, I want you to understand what this is going to look like if everything goes well. If everything goes well, we're going to do 6 weeks with this device. We're going to do 6 weeks with this device. We're going to do 6 weeks with this device, right? Then we're going to come back together, figure out like, what do we do? Look at these data, talk about where we want to go from there. Once we make a decision and provide you with access to whatever the team decided was the best way to go, we're going to have to customize that for you, right? Because you don't want, Mary Beth doesn't want to say the same things as Elizabeth does, right? And so we're going to have to customize that for you. And then you can start to learn how to use it, right? But learning to use language with those devices, that's typically something that takes a couple years, right?
Yes.
So what would we expect in the first 6 months of you having this in front of you? Well, obviously it depends on the kind of client it is, what their learning trajectory has been like and all of that. But, if this is someone who has learned everything up until this point very slowly, right? They potty train slowly. They are learning, their body parts slowly. They are learning pre-academic skills. If they are learning other things slowly, we would not anticipate that they would be any faster in learning to use a communication device. So I try to have families, have educators, have team members think about what is this individual's general learning trajectory, right? And let's talk through what that might look like now that we're applying it to AAC. Because one of the reasons that people give up is they feel like they messed up, they screwed it up, right? So it's something wrong with me as a clinician. I didn't put the right words in. I don't really know how to teach. I'm not a good therapist, right? Or, conversely, we may blame it on the student, right? Just say, oh, he's too impaired. That's great for other kids, but he's not motivated. He doesn't have the attention span, right? Whereas what's really happening here is this is exactly what we should have been expecting all the way around. It just takes a long time, right? Most of the people in this audience have had some experience with little babies, right? They didn't come out speaking in full sentences, right? Took a couple of years for that to happen, right? Even under the best of circumstances, right? Language learning and moving toward language autonomy is a lengthy process. Families don't have trouble with that if they're prepared for it. But what happens is 6 months into it, the kid's doing exactly what I expected them to do. Sometimes they're paying attention, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're pressing the same button 18 times in a row. Sometimes they're exploring and making little lists of things. That's what language learners do. Sometimes they're using it functionally with me if it's really fun, if I'm really engaging.
It's sounding like babbling to me.
Right.
Yes.
100%, right? So I'm expecting that, right? But to someone who doesn't have that, background, they're thinking, okay, well, this ain't going to work, right? And so they give up. And it's worse than them just giving up on that device at that time. What it does is far more damaging than that because they lose hope and they lose their belief in the child's potential, right? And if we can morph to a perspective where we say, hey, this ain't going to happen overnight. And let me tell you what I mean by that, right? This is not something to get into if it's something that can't be supported outside of speech therapy. Because language learning is not going to happen if it's only being prioritized when they're with me, right? This is something that communication partners need to do. So we got to come up with a plan for how to get his peers, his brothers and sisters, mom and dad, the classmates, the teachers, the aides, all of those folks using AAC support strategies. So if that's not something you're interested in, or if that's not a good fit for you right now, let's talk about that and where we can go that would be movement in this direction, but not overwhelm you, right? Because if I do something you're not capable of adopting, I worked with a family one time. I used to run an AAC preschool, and I had a kiddo in there who we never sent the AAC device home with him, right? And when you hear that, it sounds horrifying, right? Here's the reason. He was part of a triplet set. He's a kid with autism and challenging behaviors. I was his 7th preschool. Guess what happened to the first 6?
Right.
He got
I
kicked
can
out,
imagine.
right? But he was part of a triplet set. Both of his triplet siblings had autism. His older brother and sister, twins, both on the spectrum. Baby brother, also on the spectrum. 6 kids on the spectrum, right? That family was lucky to just keep those kids safe, fed and clean, right? So if I had sent AAC home with them, all it would have done is made that poor mom feel guilty. Like, here's another thing I'm not doing right. And that's not helpful to anybody, right? Let things, let's manage things in a way that really acknowledge families' realities, so that when, if we can sort of dose things appropriately for them, say, I totally get that this is not you right now, right? But let's move in that direction and you guide me as to what is doable, right? And we'll craft his AAC journey around, what that looks like. Now, there's problems with that as well. But I see far too many cases where things get abandoned, not for, a year, but for a decade, because the wind was just taken out of their sails.
Yes, I know. I appreciate you said a little while ago about dosing. Just a dose of AAC, mom and dad, or a dose of AAC just for a minute, once an hour, doing that AAC dose, and just, what's the saying? How do you eat an elephant? Just one bite at a time.
Exactly.
Well, we've talked about a lot of changes that you would like. I have a little running list here. So language, increasing the ability to express with language on the AAC devices, implementation, assessment, increasing the number of languages, getting parents to understand the process, and the team collaboration. And then one thing, that the parent buy-in. When we do have some questions or comments in the chat, that sometimes it is hard to get the parent buy-in on AAC. Do you have any advice for us?
Sure. So no magic wand, sorry about that. But some things that have been, helpful to me in looking in that is, one is that transparency that we were just talking about. Let me tell you what this is going to look like if everything goes well. There's always hiccups, but let me kind of lay that out for you. I think when we can manage our expectations, it's so much better. We're so much better able to cope with things, right? And I think of yourself, like if I have to go to the doctor for a blood draw, I want to know how many vials are taken, like how long can I hang in there, right? Like if I see that whole thing with like a million little vials in there, I'm like sweating and I'm like, I don't know if I can do this, right? But if okay, there's 3 vials, he's already on the second one, I could do this, girl. Right. So like managing our expectations is a really important, I think, tool that can help us in this regard. So I would say that kind of transparency. I think also bringing families and AAC users in the decision making is huge, right? So we generally start preparing them for what this AAC journey is going to look like in that sort of intake and assessment process, right? The more autonomy you have in the decisions about how this is going to play out, right, the more invested you are. I think also we really have to have a better understanding of what these individuals are dealing with and be able to respond to that in less judgmental, more accepting ways. Always leaving the door open for things that we wish to have happened and it just really wasn't in the cards. The other thing that I think is really important, and this scares the pants off a lot of my beginning clinician students, is you have to invite dissent and disagreement. Right. So often, I'm retired from clinical work now, but when I was doing AAC evaluations, I would say to families in front of the students, one of the things that would be very helpful to me, as a matter of fact, I consider it a personal favor, is if I'm saying anything that just doesn't ring true to you, or you don't feel comfortable with, or you just disagree with, it would be so helpful to me if you could just give me, if you would tell me about that. And just as soon as it comes up, just stop me, right? And let's talk through that. So inviting dissent, inviting different points of view. I would often, kind of try to shine some light on things that you sensed were concerns that weren't really brought out. So I might say, Mrs. Jones, you've asked a lot of really good questions today. One thing we haven't really talked about is how this is going to impact Billy's spoken language and his speech. Is that something you've thought about? Is that something we should chat about before you go today? So I'm bringing up something that, might be scary for a beginning clinician, to try to talk to a family about. But I think that sort of transparency is, how we form authentic relationships with families. And whether it's the families or the individuals that we're serving directly, our clients, everything sort of is built from that. So you don't build your castles in the sand, you build them on bedrock. So build that foundation where some trust begins to be built between the two of us. So that, the things that I'm asking them to do, if it's not something that they can feasibly do, I'm going to know that before they leave, right? So that I can say, oh my goodness, how did I miss that? Let me step back. I'm going to give this some thought. And the next time I see you, I'm going to have a better plan and you'll tell me if that works any better.
Thank you. Okay, we're getting close on time. Elizabeth, do you want to ask about the case studies?
Sure. I know, Dr. Zangari, you mentioned two of your friends in your early working career that heavily influenced you, but there have been any other memorable or impactful cases during your career?
Oh, so many. Living in South Florida for 30 years, you see it all. You really do. And I've just learned so much. I know we don't have a lot of time left, but the one that I think comes to mind first was Lance, who was born with spina bifida and then had a brain herniation that essentially left him deafblind at age 16. Being called in to help his school team. They had given him, he had had a corneal transplant, so he could see a little bit if you put it right up to his nose, and it was really big. And just being able to, they'd given him an AAC device that had 4 enormous pictures. And, going to that first, home visit prior to the AAC evaluation, my students in tow, and figuring out that, oh my goodness, his spelling and reading skills are still intact, right? So if we could figure out a way to communicate, because he can't hear me, so I can't explain things, and he can barely see, so we used writing, like big, bold, like Sharpie kinds of markers. We were able to do the assessment, got him a device that was a much better fit for him. It ended up that, he was a client in our therapy clinic for quite a long time, and he ended up co-presenting with me at 2 international conferences. So,
Oh,
Wow.
these are the ones that really stay with you, after all these years.
hmm. Well, that is, thank you so much for sharing that. Okay, I got a little housekeeping here. We are at the hour, so for anyone who is participating, if you need to go now, you will get your full credit. Make sure you complete all course modules on your Speech Therapy PD account today. For anyone else who can stay for a few minutes, we can finish up here. Dr. Zangari, would 5 more minutes work for you?
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. So, what advice would you like to share with new or future clinicians?
All right, let me think here. I think the first is maybe be curious. Don't take everything at face value. Develop strong skills in clinical reasoning, right? Don't get distracted by the next shiny thing. Be that skeptic, right? Filter things through your own sort of, critical analysis. In this day and age with all the AI, particularly, like I think we're all thinking that a little bit more, like, where'd that come from, and all of that. So I think, be a little bit skeptical, keep that critical thinking cap tied tightly under your chin. The other thing, and I would say this to all of us really, is be gentle with yourself, right? Like just be gentle, forgive yourself. Um, you know, um, this is not easy work. This is not an easy time to be alive. People are coming to us with all sorts of complexities, with mental health challenges, with all sorts of complexities, and relating to one another, human to human, it is the most important thing. So there's lots of things that we have to do. We feel the pressure all the time, but just be a little more gentle with yourself.
Well, thank you. And Elizabeth, is there anything else that you wanted to ask?
There would be so many things, but
Yeah,
I know
I know.
An hour or two.
we're limited on time, but
I
just
did promise
thank
the
you.
participants that I would look through the questions at the end. So here is one. Okay, I had a random question sort of about your thoughts on compliance versus connection. I see a lot of information about connection and the relationship with our AAC users, but I also saw some information from Cough Drop about how to intertwine the two.
Hmm.
And she said, I hope that makes sense.
I'm always a believer that a more moderate approach is going to get me a little further. So I tend to be one that stays away from things that are compliance oriented and really addresses more of the connection. Certainly, as I was saying before, that sort of avenue of, building authentic relationships is where I would say we should be investing most of our energies early on. Having said that, there is a role for structure. There is a role for, they're coming to us for a skilled service, right? And for me to effectively and efficiently get you from where you are now to where you want to go, right? The best way forward may be with some structure. So, for example, in my therapy, I've said this to my students many times, you'll rarely hear me say that there's a strategy I use with every client I ever work with, from somebody with aphasia to ALS to somebody with profound intellectual disabilities or autism, and that is using visual schedules. Right? Now it looks very different, right? For somebody who's coming for therapy and was a, former chief of staff at the hospital, than it does to somebody with very profound, intellectual disability, right? It looks, how we operationalize it looks different. But the idea that we have a plan of action here, right, is one that I think helps organize our brains, and one that helps us get back on track when we fall off of it. Now, one thing that I've evolved in my thinking over time is how to use those, how to implement them. So, it informs us. It doesn't dictate what we are going to do. If it is a client for whom personal autonomy is really important, we'll make that schedule together, right? And maybe there's some things I know I need to start and end with, right? We got to start with our hello song, right? Because that gets your brain and body together, right? And it gets it knowing what to expect. But after that, here's these 8 different activities I'm prepared to use to teach you, right? And I know you like them. So you pick which ones are we going to do and in what order, right? So we look for ways, and that is something that's evolved, I think, is how do we tailor things to give you as much autonomy as is possible and still get the job done.
Okay. Well, as Elizabeth said, we could ask questions all day. I'm gonna and anyone who
I
needs
wouldn't
to
be
go,
sad.
go. I'm gonna ask one last one because I think it is important. What do you say to teachers who say that the AAC device distracts other students in the classroom?
I say, oh, I bet he's the only student in your class that you've ever taught who's distracted other kids. Right?
That is a good
Kids are annoying.
answer.
They're distracting. Yeah. They're little peanuts,
Right.
They go do crazy things. They rip stuff up. They poke stuff to get a reaction, right? Kids are kids. That's who they are. Don't treat AAC users differently than the other kinds of kids, right? So, if you have another kid in the class who is, annoying, is disruptive, you have a way of consequating them. You have a way of handling that. Consider, right, what that might look like for your student who uses AAC, right? I think that, it's just, it's just, to me, common sense.
Yes,
right?
yes. And I know there were some other comments. If you have a question for Dr. Zangari, she has so kindly shared her email address. And Elizabeth, you're going to put that in the
I will
chat.
go ahead and put that in the
Right?
chat.
Okay,
yes.
And then I will close here. So we really appreciate all your contributions to our field and coming today with us and sharing those with us, and sharing your perspective. You taught us so much, and we have wonderful comments in the chat thanking you. So we all appreciate that. And again, as a reminder, this episode is available for Point 1 ASHA CEUs, and to earn ASHA CEUs, please complete all course modules of this episode on your SpeechTherapyPD account. So, Dr. Zangari, any last words for our?
Thank you. Like the people who are here today, you gave up an hour. That's not nothing. I really, really appreciate your commitment to AAC and your willingness to think deeply about how you serve the children and adults on your caseload.
Thank you, Dr. Zangari. This was fantastic.
Well, I loved being with you and hope to our paths cross again.
Well, thank you so much. And again, thank you to our audience and our future participants as well.
Have a good day.
Take care.
Evening,
Have
everybody.
a great day.
Enjoy the conference, Elizabeth.
I will. Thank you.